Thanks for the opportunity to present an update on the ICH E2D guideline, E2D R1. I'm Craig Zinderman, Associate Director for Medical Policy in the Office of Biostatistics and Pharmacovigilance in FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. I'll start with an overview of what the E2D guideline is about, although in brief, it discusses the management and reporting of post-approval safety information. And then we'll talk about some background information on why it was decided to revise the guideline. And then we'll highlight some of the biggest changes that we've made in this revised version of the guideline, including some key new definitions and terminology, the different types of individual case safety reports in the post-approval setting, spontaneous reports and solicited reports. And then most importantly, we'll go through the different sources of safety information, things like digital platforms, internet, patient support programs, literature, and we'll talk about what's been changed in this revised version of the guideline for each source. And then last, we'll cover some scenarios that marketing authorization holders observe in post-approval safety data other than adverse events or adverse drug reactions. And we'll talk about how we've expanded that section on other observations. So what is E2D? The title of E2D is Post-Approval Safety Data, Definitions and Standards for Management and Reporting of Individual Case Safety Reports. This document provides some standardized procedures for post-approval safety data management and the guidance for gathering and reporting this information. It basically provides some of the foundational definitions and concepts and guidance for how MAHs collect and report post-approval data. For example, it defines an adverse event, an adverse drug reaction, and what qualifies as serious AEs or ADRs. And there's definitions for several other fundamental terms that we use in post-market adverse event surveillance. It also defines the timeline for submitting expedited ICSRs. I should note that the original E2D guideline is limited to expedited ICSRs, and it talks about expedited in the title. In this new revised guideline, we've expanded the scope to include all ICSRs, and we've changed the title accordingly. The fundamental concepts and guidance provided in the guideline really apply more broadly to all ICSRs and not just expedited cases. E2D also goes on to discuss various sources of post-approval safety data, for example, information from the internet or information from literature or spontaneous reports that are communicated directly to an MAH and various other sources, and how cases from each of those sources should be managed. So by way of background, the original ICH E2D guideline was adopted as an approved guideline in 2003, so it's more than 20 years old. There's been a bunch of new post-market safety information data sources that have emerged, or at least are used much more often, more frequently today than they were back in the early 2000s. And these new data sources vary in their characteristics and their contribution to post-market safety surveillance. They could have a different level of quality in how much they contribute to what we know about the safety of products, yet they can be really large volume and large burden for marketing authorization holders and regulators alike. Things like patient support programs are used a lot more frequently today than they were in the early 2000s. And then, of course, social media is much more widespread and a source for post-market safety data about medical products like anything else. So it was determined that the definitions and regulatory guidance in the original guideline, which didn't really cover these things like patient support programs and digital platforms or social media, is no longer sufficient to provide guidance on current pharmacovigilance practices. And so an ICH E2D expert working group was formed in 2019 to revise E2D so that it supports more appropriate and more current post-market safety surveillance. The recommendations in the revised guideline are harmonized to the extent possible, but there are a number of differences in post-market safety reporting requirements across the ICH regions. So it wasn't always possible to have guidance that's consistent in every region. Some of these requirements in different areas have changed since the original guideline in 2003. So in places in the guideline where it's needed, where it's applicable, the guideline notes where local and regional requirements may vary, and as such, marketing authorization holders should refer to those local and regional requirements with respect to that particular concept or term. But despite these regional variations, the expert working group believes that the revision, the E2DR1, establishes a harmonized framework for current best practices for managing post-approval safety data, particularly around the reporting terminology and the emerging new sources of data like patient support programs and digital platforms. We're going to talk more about those in a moment. We should note that these slides highlight only the significant updates and changes made in the revised version, the R1 version, and that you should refer to the complete document for all other editorial changes and updates. The expert working group had fairly wide representation across both regulators and industry, with 9 regulators and 5 different industry subgroups participating. The plenary working party for this expert working group includes MHRA from the United Kingdom and Health Canada. There were several brand new definitions added to the revised version of the guideline, and I'm going to highlight some of the key new definitions. One of those is an explicit definition for the term individual case safety report, or ICSR. This is a term that appears in the old guideline, but only once in reference to E2B, which is the ICH standard for electronic transmission of post-market cases to regulators. But the term ICSR wasn't as widely used in that time in 2003, and it wasn't used. It didn't feature prominently in the original guideline, and it didn't have a definition in the original guideline. The new version provides an explicit definition, a description of an adverse event or adverse drug reaction in an individual patient at a specific point in time. This definition also lists 4 minimum criteria for a case to qualify for reporting to regulatory authorities. And those include a suspect product, an adverse event or adverse drug reaction, an identifiable patient, and an identifiable reporter. The revised guideline also includes explicit definitions for expedited reports that are submitted within 15 days, and primary source. And the primary source is the individual who provides information about the case to the MAH, or the marketing authorization holder. Some other key definitions were added to support the management and reporting of cases from some of the newly emerging sources of post-approval safety data that are increasingly encountered by MAHs. Digital platforms, for instance, is defined in the new guideline as the software and technology used to enable transmission of information between users. And this term, digital platforms, is used in the revision in place of the term internet in the original guideline. It's a broad definition, and it includes, but it isn't limited to, social media, websites, internet forums, chat rooms, and software applications. ODCS is also defined, and this includes clinical trials, registries, and patient support programs, among other things. Note that in the revised guideline, the definition includes a list of basic documentation that MAHs should have for ODCSs that they're conducting. There are also new definitions of patient support program and market research program, and we'll talk about these more in a moment. All 4 of these concepts were areas of specific focus for the EWG in coming together to do the revisions for E2DR1. Section 3, the types of ICSRs, is a new section in the new guideline. The concepts of spontaneous reports and solicited reports used to exist in the section of the guideline on sources of post-approval safety data, but it was moved to its own section because spontaneous and solicited, these concepts really refer to the context in which an ICSR is gathered rather than a specific source of data. Spontaneous reports refers to direct communications by a healthcare provider or consumer to a regulatory authority or an MAH that is not gathered as part of an ODCS, whereas solicited reports are those gathered as part of an ODCS. Both spontaneous reports and solicited reports in the ICH E2D electronic reporting standard can be designated as either being spontaneous or solicited. Solicited in that standard is called report from study in E2B. Section 4 of the guideline goes through the different sources of post-approval safety information that can end up as ICSRs. In particular, updates were made to the section on the literature, and these updates include harmonized guidance on the screening of medical and scientific journals, a clarification of when the reporting time clock, 15 days for expedited cases, starts for literature cases. The start of that clock is called day 0, and several other updates to help clarify expectations for marketing authorization holders in the management of safety data from literature. Again, I won't be going through every section in the guideline. I'm just picking out the key changes that were really responsive to the reasons that ICH formed the expert working group and set out to revise the guideline. And one of those reasons is digital platforms or the internet. This section replaces the internet section in the previous version of the guideline. Importantly, this section makes a distinction between how cases are managed based on whether the marketing authorization holder has responsibility for the content that's on the digital platform, which is the source of the information for the case, or whether they don't have responsibility for that content. So for example, a company's own product website would be a digital platform, of course, that they manage and they control the content. And so that digital platform would be considered under the MAH's responsibility. And the guideline provides a description of what that means, whether or not a digital platform would be under an MAH responsibility or not. As is the case in the original guideline, the revised version also goes on to say that marketing authorization holders have no obligation to screen digital platforms for which they don't have responsibility, or digital platforms that are external sites. However, if the digital platform is under the MAH's responsibility, they are required to regularly screen that platform in order to find and appropriately manage adverse events or adverse drug reaction information that may be posted on those platforms. Cases should be managed as either spontaneous or solicited, depending on the nature of the activity, depending on the context in which that data was collected, whether it was spontaneous or solicited. Well, MAHs aren't required to go out and actively screen digital platforms not under their responsibility, that is, external platforms. They do more and more frequently encounter post-approval safety data from these sites. The revised guideline provides some recommendations on how MAHs might go about managing the potential adverse events and adverse drug reaction information that they find on these kinds of platforms. MAHs can screen the data using an organized data collection system. Recall that an ODCS requires that the MAH have some basic documentation on their plan for their organized data collection. Using the ODCS, the MAHs should appropriately collect and manage adverse events and adverse drug reaction cases that they encounter while executing their plan for the digital platform data, but they don't have to actively go out and screen or search the entire data set to find adverse events or adverse drug reactions that may be somewhere in there in the data set beyond conducting their planned ODCS analysis. The revised guideline also clarifies the start of the time clock for regulatory reporting of cases identified from digital platform data not under the MAH's responsibility. And last, and perhaps most important, the guideline proposes the addition of a few new values in the E2B reporting standard. And we're proposing that there'll be a new value, a flag, that will identify which cases were sourced from ODCSs conducted on a digital platform. All solicited cases are coded in E2D as report from study, but that includes any type of study, observational studies, registries, patient support programs even. And so this flag will allow regulators and industry to parse out which study cases were from this data source and digital platform, as opposed to a non-interventional study or a patient support program or some other ODCS. And the expert working group believes that the ability to identify this, which cases are digital platform, which cases are patient support program, will be of significant benefit for signal detection purposes. The next source discussed are patient support programs. The new definition for patient support programs provides some clarity and some guardrails on what programs can be considered patient support programs. This is a concept that's now widely used, but not really well standardized. The definition includes a few important concepts. First, all patient support programs are considered ODCSs. Second, to be a patient support program, a program must include collection of medical information or be designed such that the program will likely receive medical information. And last, this definition excludes programs that strictly involve delivery of a medical product to a patient's home or which only give out coupons or discounts. These kind of programs don't involve the two-way type of interaction that's described by the collection of medical information, and so they don't qualify as PSPs under this definition. Because PSPs involve the interaction between the MEH and the consumer or healthcare provider, and adverse events and adverse drug reactions are typically collected by the MEH in the context of that interaction, the safety reports from PSPs are considered solicited or study reports. And again, there's a proposal in the new guideline to add a flag of value in E2B that would identify cases for patients from patient support programs, and that would help in signal evaluation. And the last source of post-approval safety information that I'll mention are market research programs, or MRPs. As with PSPs, this definition is new. And again, MRPs are also all considered organized data collection systems, ODCSs, and cases from these kinds of data collection should be managed as solicited. And again, just like with PSPs and digital platforms, there is a proposal to add a new value in E2B that would identify which study cases came from MRP's market research program. Chapter 5 talks about what should be reported, and this section was updated so that it's more harmonized across regions. Some of these regions have revised their requirements for reporting adverse reaction data, particularly with respect to what things are considered, or what are the requirements for serious reports versus non-serious reports, or unexpected versus expected reports. And so the new description of what should be reported is adapted to be more harmonized across regions. The section also discusses what we call other observations. These are scenarios that in most regions are not considered adverse events or adverse drug reactions in and of themselves, and the guideline provides some clarified advice on what are the reporting observation, or what are the reporting obligations for these kinds of other observations, and in general, to report them only to a regulatory authority if it's required by the authorities in that local country or region. This is actually an exciting time for the E2D group. This draft was just approved by ICH and by the regulatory stakeholders to be published for public consultation, which is a significant milestone in the drafting of a guideline. All stakeholders can find the full guideline at the links presented on this slide, and can also provide their comments and feedback for the expert working group's consideration as we revise the guideline. Shortly, many of the individual regions will also publish the draft for comments in their respective regions and for comments from their respective public stakeholders. The public consultation period is expected to conclude this summer, at which time the expert working group will review and revise the guideline as needed based on the comments. The expert working group's work plan forecasts reaching a finalized guideline in May of 2025. So thanks again for the opportunity to present this update.